back. I just want to say sorry that I'd always be exposing Marcus Rogers, but I know he's a false teacher. Everybody is not on the same level as like the Sakioids. I'm like more reading on my channel and talking about other things and reading the scriptures. And yes, I agree to expose false teachers, but I expose false teachers and then move on to the next subject and whatever. But yeah, I believe in So I'm reading about abuse, understanding and healing abuse by Stephen R. Tracy. Thus far, we've seen a very game portrait. If abuse is widely distributed through all sectors of society, and has been so throughout human history due to human depravity and satanic influence, what hope is there? It is personally at the juncture of intractable evil, abuse, and human misery. That the Christian gospel offers the only possible hope. The God declared in the Bible is not like the Greek gods on Mount Olympus who drank ambrosia and consulted with knives while humans squirm on earth. Rather, God is deeply moved by human suffering. Hosea chapter 11 verse 8 and Matthew chapter 9 verse 36 and John chapter 11 verse 35, and is committed to heal and redeem the broken at the greatest possible cost. Exodus chapter 2 verse 23. Romans chapter 5 verse 8. Jesus Christ did not come for the healthy, but to redeem the sick and broken. Matthew 9 verse 12 verse 13. The writer of Hebrews beautifully declares that Christ took on human flesh so that he could die, and in so doing render Satan and the death important and break the chains of human bondage. Hebrews chapter 2 verse 14 verse 15. The credible irony of the gospel for abuse victims is that Jesus suffered the most extreme form of physical abuse, such that the broken could be healed by his surgeon, our hero. Isaiah 53 verse 5. In fact, this irony is so great that the dogmatic symbol of Christianity is an instrument of satanic sadistic abuse across when one understands the grotesque nature of crucifixion, by which the founder of Christianity made early Christian leaders were tortured to death. It's amazing that Christians image their faith with a cross. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 2. It would be comparable to Jews making the symbol of Judaism a miniature crematorium they wear around their necks and place on their synagogues. The cross is the most powerful symbol imaginable of God's ability to heal and redeem abuse. This side of heaven, no one can offer a fully satisfactory answer for why God continues to allow evil and suffering. We do know, however, that God delights in taking suffering, evil, and creating good out of them. Romans chapter 8 verse 28. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 8 verse 18. Philippians chapter 1 verse 12 verse 14. One of the most beautiful statements of such divine redemption of damage and evil is found in Genesis chapter 50 verse 20. When Joseph declared to his abusive brothers, You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. What is that? The statement highlights the fact that God is sovereign even over evil. What the brothers intended for Joseph's destruction, God perfectly redeemed in the most dramatic fashion. He brought the individual healing and restoration to Joseph, but also used the very circumstances created by their abuse to bring about the deliverance of their entire family and ultimately the Israelite nation. The Apostle Paul, a collaborator in fatal abuse of Stephan and the former physical abuser of Christians. Acts chapter 8, verse 1, verse 3. Became the Christian church's greatest missionary and teacher. He, in return, experienced much abuse, slander, beatings, and whippings, and stonings, imprisonments, and even murder attempts. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23, verse 33. After enduring incredible suffering, Paul declared that through all of the abuse, Christ was sweeter and stronger in his life. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 8, verse 18. God always desires to heal our brokenness and to use it as the very nutrient to draw us into a deeper spirit of joyful intimacy with him and to give us an opportunity for a more fruitful ministry to others who are also broken. Romans chapter 8, verse 17. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 4, verse 6. Mary, the missionary daughter abused by her cousin, is now a young woman. She is a testimony to God's power to heal a shattered soul from the ravage of evil. Mary still bears scars on her body from the many times she cut ravages of evil. Mary still bears scars on her body from the many times she cut herself with a razor. For years after the abuse, the cutting was the only thing that made her feel better. Now the most notable features on Mary's body are not the scars on her arms and legs, but the light in her eyes and the impish smile on her lips. Mary will slowly learn to trust God. She has slowly learned to trust men. Mary has devoted her professional career to working with abused children, and she is still growing and healing. But she recently told me that for the first time in her life, she truly believes God has redeemed her abuse. This book is dedicated to all the Marys in the world who have suffered the evil of abuse and who need to experience the healing of redemption that only the crucified Christ can bring. So this book is dedicated to all the Marys in the world who has suffered the evil of abuse and who needs to experience the healing of redemption that's only the crucified Christ can bring. Abuse as a perversion of the image of God. Until God brought Mary into my life, I simply didn't comprehend the staggering impact of abuse. I was particularly shocked at the images of this beautiful little girl who had haunting memories of abuse that would repeatedly engulf her in such toxic clouds of self in the hidden shame that she would viscerally slice her own body with a razor. How could sexual fondant that had occurred years before cause a bright and gift young girl who had grown up in a loving Christian family to have such self-loathing and shame that cutting herself with a razor actually brought a twisted sense of release? I used to cut myself when I was younger too. After Mary had disclosed her abuse, her parents sought counsel from Dr. Susan Jones, a Galley Christian pediatrician who specialized in working with high-risk adolescents in California juvenile justice system. Dr. Jones explained to Mary confused parents that in 10 years after treating adolescents, she had worked with hundreds of teens who cut themselves. Nearly all of her young autistic patients who self-mutilated had been sexually abused. In some strange way, the unrighted pain in their souls was temporarily assaulted by deliberately creating pain in their bodies. How is it that sexual abuse generates such powerful self-destructive urges? Abuse opens a Pandora's box of long-term destructive fallout that raises a host of troubling questions. Why is it that women who have been abused during childhood are sensitively more likely to be re-victimized in adulthood? Why are adult female prostitutes 3 to 4 times more likely than non-prostitutes to have been physically or sexually abused in childhood? Why is it that 70 to 80% of sex addicts are survivors of physical or sexual abuse? Why is it that 50 to 70% of psychiatric patients and 70% of all psychiatric emergency room patients report a history of childhood physical or sexual abuse? Why is it the majority of men who beat their wives and or children experience childhood physical abuse? One might logically expect that men who experienced the horror of abuse in childhood would be the least likely to be abusers themselves, not wanting to inflict that kind of pain on their loved ones that has inflicted on them. The unpleasant truth is that abuse has profound, wildly irrational consequences. It tears the soul. The only way we can truly understand the effects of abuse is to clarify what it means to be a human being made in the image of God, and to understand the devastating impact of abuse. We need to understand the manner in which abuse perverts the image of God in humans. Made in the image of God, Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Christian theologically asserts that humans are not just the most highly evolved mammals at the top of the food chain. We are not simply the most complex machines that accidentally arose out of a primitive soup millions of years ago. Rather, humans are dazzling unique among the entire creation realm, for only humans are made in the very image of God. As one theologian wisely notes, being made in God's image confers on the human subject the highest possible destination, leaving the world of the animals far behind. Here is the language used of no other creature's language, is language that teaches us to understand ourselves in terms of God rather than in terms of the animals. The Bible is very clear that all humans are uniquely made in the image of God. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, and James chapter 3, verse 9. In fact, being made in God's image lies on the core of what it means to be human. For when God chose to create humans, He made them in his own image, Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. Our challenge is to understand more precisely what the image of God means, since the Bible nowhere defines this moderately important phrase. The best way to make sense of the image of God is to look at the creation account in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Verse 28, where this phrase first appears, we should note first that the biblical account of human creation is distinctly different from other ancient Mesopotamian creation accounts in which humans are created as an afterthought to provide the gods with food and relieve them of work. Moses, on the other hand, tells us that humans are the aspects of our creation, for only after Adam and Eve are created does God pronounce his finished work as very good. Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, the first chapter of the Bible, tells us that God did a magnificent, unique work when he created humans, for they alone are created in such a way. That they mirror the sovereign Lord of the universe. While there are many theories about the nature of being made in God's image, I believe it's best to understand it is as referring to all that we are as humans. Thus, there are various aspects to the image of God that can be seen in the creation account. The first aspect of the image of God seen in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 is the relational aspect. By virtue of being made in God's image, humans have the captivity, longing, and need for intimate relationship based on the truth that God himself is a relational God who is in intimate relationship with his own divine being. Jesus himself spoke of the loving intimacy he had with the Father and prays that his children will reflect God through intimate human relationships. John chapter 17, verse 21, verse 23. Apparently, when God chose to create creatures who would mirror who he is the best, and maybe the only way to do so was to create not just an individual, but a pair who was very sexually as male and female, complements and draws each to the other. The relational aspect of being made in God's image has profound implications. The New Testament teaches that intimate relationships in the Christian community are essential for spiritual growth. Acts chapter 4, verse 32, verse 34. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24, verse 25. James chapter 5, verse 16. Furthermore, social scientists have discovered that healthy relationships are essential for social, intellectual, and emotional growth. Children who are completely cut off from human contact develop permanent social and intellectual impairment. Research on attachment has shown the tremendous long-term social and emotional significance for children to have a sincere attachment with their parents. The human need for a relationship is so profound that infants who are fed, clothed, and given medical care but are deprived of physical touch or often fail to thrive and left untouched may actually die. Yet we must remember that our very captivity for intimate relationships based on being made in God's image creates great vulnerability in a sinful, abusive world. A second aspect of the image of God is seen in the language of Genesis 1, verse 26. In our image, according to our likeness, we might call this the visible aspect of the image of God. It is the aspect of the image of God in which humans visible demonstrate God's attributes. We see this in the very terminology of this manifest who God is, that is, they are to make visible the visible God. Colossians chapter 1 verse 15, as with the first absence of the image of God, we can anticipate great damage when humans, especially children who are idealistic and vulnerable, looks to the key adults expecting to get a glimpse of what God is like, but in reality getting a picture of what Satan is like. This can be compared to a lost child who is dehydrated and in desperate need of water. If the thirsty child finds a bottle of clear fluid labeled mineral water, it would be particularly perverse if the child, after drinking the liquid, is in good faith, became gravely ill because the fluid was actually poison. The child would come to fear the very thing needed to sustain life, water. Children need and deserve to glean a sense of the character of God from watching their adult caregivers. Adults who distort the image of God cause great harm to spiritually thirsty children. A third and final aspect of the image of God is often called the functional aspect, the aspect in which humans function as God's representatives on earth. In terms of creation, we are his vice regents or representative in caring for the creation. The Bible account of creation suggests this aspect of the image of God, for in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26. Let us make man in our image is immediately followed by and let them rule. We also see this in Genesis 2, for God waited to create some of the plants until Adam and had been created to care for them. Genesis chapter 2 verse 5. God put Adam in the garden to cultivate it and keep it. Genesis chapter 2 verse 15. While the Bible ultimately assigns the providential care over the creation world to God himself, Psalms chapter 104 verse 14 verse 30. Acts chapter 14 verse 17. God made humans in his image as his functional representatives to care for creation. This involves both control. Genesis chapter 1, 26, Psalms chapter 8, verse 5 or 6, and cultivation. Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. We can easily see how this aspect of the image of God can be distorted. Instead of functioning properly as God's representatives to care for creation, we can rule harshly over creation and grossly misrepresent who God is. When humans do not function as God's representatives but use their power to dominate rather than mature, much long-term damage is done. It's so weird. The effects of sin, Genesis chapter 3. While Genesis chapter 2 ends on an incredibly beautiful note of relational intimacy, the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. This intimacy is immediately shattered by sin in Genesis chapter 3. As soon as Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit, all three aspects of the image of God are disrupted and disordered. Instead of mirroring and enjoying relational intimacy, immediately after eating the fruit, they tried to hide from each other, from God. Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, verse 8. So satisfying intimacy is perverted into shameful hiding. Instead of visibly manifesting the character of God, they manifest ungodliness and unholiness. Instead of functioning as God's representatives and caring for creation, their sin caused creation to be harmed and cursed. Genesis chapter 3, verse 14, verse 16. At every level, sin corrupted the image of God through it, did not eliminate it. At this juncture, we should note the relevance of the curse recorded in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16 to the issue of abuse. Instead of joyful living out of the image of God through physical reproduction, a very godlike activity, the woman would now experience pain in childbirth. Instead of acting as a spiritual equal who complements the man, the woman would have an unhealthy, savage dependence on the man. Your desire will be for your husband. It's so weird. Instead of the man treating the woman as a divine gift who could complete him as an intimate equal, the falling man would seek to harshly rule over the woman as an inferior. Scripture and human history repeatedly bears out the actuality of this horrible prediction. Throughout history, men have repeatedly abused the power, and women have repeatedly been appropriately and dangerously dependent on men. The Bible describes numerous instances: Isaiah chapter 10, verse 1, verse 2, Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 6, verse 12, Micah chapter 2, verse 9. For example, where those with power, typically males, use this power to exploit and abuse those with less power, typically females and children. In a clarification of who is great in the kingdom of Jesus reminds his disciples that the Gentile political rulers, who were virtually all male, used their authority to dominate harshly those under their care. Whereas in the kingdom of God, greatness is expressed through humble or serve-like. Luke chapter 22, verse 25, verse 26. In short, in the following word, our godlike privilege of creating and nurturing life is perverted through the abuse of power. Because men typically have greater physical and social power, they are often the perpetrators of abuse. For instance, research show that men are responsible for about 80 to 90% of child sexual abuse. The United States Department of Justice reports that in 1998, women experienced physical violence by an intimate partner, in most instances a man, at a rate 5 times higher than the violence men experience from their predominantly female partners. At the same time, when women are in positions of power, especially over their children, they as fallen sinners were also abused that power. The most recent national index study shows that 65% of all maltreated abused children are maltreated by a female, and when children are maltreated by a birth parent, 75% of the time they are maltreated by their mother. The national index study also found that children are twice as likely to be neglected by a female as a male. The dynamic of the abuse of power helps us to understand why over 3/4 of abused or neglected children are abused by their own birth parents. For birth parents typically have the greatest power over a child. Abuse as a perversion of the image of God. Abuse is rarely about the abuse of power over another individual, and abuse that perverts the divinely ordained image of God. In the next few pages, we'll define 5 different kinds of abuse and describe how they are a perversion of the image of God. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect abuse, spiritual abuse, verbal abuse, a perversion of one flesh, a perversion of let them rule, physical abuse, neglect abuse, a perversion of cultivate the ground, spiritual abuse, a perversion of image, verbal abuse, a perversion to be fruitful. Sexual abuse, a perversion of one flesh. A teacher recently told me about a call she had received from a woman in her Sunday school class seeking advice on a moral dilemma. She and her husband frequently traveled with their 3 adult children, as do most families on a limited budget. They shared a hotel room when they traveled. Her dilemma: her husband, an active member of a vibrant evangelical church known for solid Bible exposition, was pressuring her to have sex with him in the motel room with their 3 children, in other beds a few feet away from theirs. He reasoned that the Bible nowhere prohibited this, so she was obligated to comply with his demand. Apparently, this man did not realize or care that by deliberately exposing his children to his sex acts with his wife, he could be persecuted by the state for child sexual abuse, and he could cause damage to his children. Sexual abuse is the application of a minor for the sexual gratification of another person through sexual contact or sexual interaction. And I was sexually abused as a child at 7 years old by my uncles. So sick. Abusive sexual contact can be described on a descending continue and concludes intercourse, attempted intercourse, oral sex. Gentle contact, breast contact, intentional, sexual touching of buttocks or thighs, stimulated intercourse, touching of clothes, breasts, and sexual kissing. Abusive sexual interaction includes direct exposure of a minor to pornography or sexual activity, inhibition. This graphic description is necessary because many people mistakenly believe sexual abuse must involve sexual intercourse, or at least genital contact with a minor. Furthermore, even when people accept that sexual abuse encompasses a broad range of behaviors, they often assume that only abuse involving intercourse creates several damage. On the contrary, all sexual abuse is extremely damaging. Diane Russell, one of America's foremost authorities on sexual abuse, found that in the case of the least severe forms of sexual abuse, sexual kissing, sexual touching of the buttocks or thighs, etc., almost 20% of the abuse victims experience extreme trauma. And in the next 2 least severe forms of sexual abuse, touching of clothes, breasts, etc., 35% of the victims experience extreme trauma. I repeatedly witnessed the devastating effects of sexual abuse that did not involve sexual intercourse. Sexual abuse is incredibly damaging because as creatures made in God's image, sex is the most powerful bonding activity in which we can engage. God's intention is that in marriage, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife and become one flesh. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Loving marital sex can powerfully bond, but though abused, it can just as powerful wound. I often hear church leaders express great impatience with sexual abuse survivors who continue to experience the damaging effects of their abuse. They make remarks such as, "For crying out loud, that happened years ago. Lots of girls get touched like that. Get over it. How long is this woman going to nurse this abuse? These kinds of ignorant and destructive comments completely ignore the biblical data in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 15, verse 18. Drawing on the bonding imagery of Genesis 1 and 2, Paul declares that the sex act is unlike any other act we commit. When we sin sexually or by implication or sin against sexually, it forms a unique bonding which creates damage that goes beyond anything else we can do with our body. As Paul concludes in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, flee immorality. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. Sexual relations are to be a beautiful divine gift that expresses unconditional love and should be a source of emotional and even physical life. Sexual abuse greatly distorts the relational absence of the image of God and the divine plan for sexuality. With sexual abuse, sex no longer gives life, but destroys life. With sexual abuse, sex does not express selfless love, but destructive selfishness. As a result, sexual abuse survivors struggle to accept their own sexuality in their own bodies. They also struggle in marriage to enjoy sanctified sex. Women who have been abused often can't admit to being enjoyed and described by a godly man. Sexual abuse is a sad perversion of the one flesh relationship. Physical abuse and perversion of let them rule. With respect to child abuse, physical abuse is legally defined as in non-accidental injury to a minor by an adult or caregiver. This can include blows, so this can include blows, shakings, burnings, or other physical assaults that cause injury to the child. Domestic abuse can be broadly described as the use of or threat of physical violence. to control an adult family member, particularly a spouse. This can include threats, shoving, slaps, hair pulling, punches, kicks, injury, or killing of pets. Destruction of personal possessions, assaults with inanimate objects, and assaults with lethal weapons. Physical abuse of children and spouses is a great perversion of the functional aspect of the image of God. We are to care for creation as God's representatives by cultivating and exercising responsible dominion. Through physical abuse, we injure and demolish what we should nurture, sustain, and enhance. Instead of functioning as God's gracious representatives to care for creation, physical abuse distorts the image and character of God, since God has put it in the human heart for children and spouses to crave love and affection from family members. Physical abuse at the hands of parents and spouses, the very ones whose hands should caress us, is the most destructive. Various people in our church had told me that Jessica was a very angry young woman who was a difficult person for her family to live with. One day, Jessica's husband, Don, a successful restaurant owner, called me and reported that he and Jessica were on the verge of divorce, and he was distraught over the prospect of losing his wife. When I probed for her the root of the problem, he said they just couldn't communicate and kept getting very angry at each other. He trolled for the sympathy by telling me that Jessica had left him for several weeks to live with her parents. I grew increasingly concerned when Don admitted he got so angry that he couldn't think rationally and often couldn't remember that he had said or done after that. After their fights, he didn't tell me what I later learned. He grew up watching his own father beat his mother. That was post-pandemic training for family life. What he also failed to tell me was that he had been threatening, slapping, and shoving Jessica on a regular basis. She lived in stark terror of violent rages, which had been edifying. Don had recently slapped Jessica so hard that he split her lip and knocked her to the ground. Up until this point, other church leaders had unanimously concluded that Jessica was simply an immature Christian who needed to be more cooperative in her marriage. The truth was Jessica was experiencing physical and emotional trauma from Don's physical abuse. Don and Jessica, 3 young children, were also experiencing significant damage from their violent home environment. take. Neglect is closely connected with physical abuse. Overly is opposite of physical abuse, but produces similar results instead of a failure of actions. Physical abuse is failure to act. Neglect is failure of a parent or guardian to provide a minor with adequate food, clothing, medical care, protection, supervision, and emotional support. It is a perversion of the functional opposite of the image of God in which humans are to cultivate the ground. Genesis chapter 2, verse 5, to function as God's representatives by tenderly caring for the creation. If we are called to responsibly care for the plants and animals God created, how much more should parents tenderly care for their own children who are utterly dependent on them? Neglect can be chronic or occasional and is very damaging. In either instance, God has harsh words for professing Christians. Parents who refuse to provide equity for their own children. See 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. So, guys, I've been through that sexual abuse as I was little as 7 years old, and I've been through the verbal abuse, the physical abuse, all abuse when I was a child, going through all the trauma events. But amazingly, I survived all that. Like, Christy had grown up at First Presbyterian Church. Many of her relatives attended there. When Christy was in junior high, Mark, her 21-year-old lay-long pastor, formed a special relationship with her over an extended period of time. Mark took advantage of his spiritual authority in Christy's life to develop a sexualized relationship with her. He told Christy that their relationship was pure and that it was ordained by God. He also implied that she would experience physical harm if she reported the relationship. Christy loved the attention but was in emotional turmoil over her special relationship with Mark. His caress and sexual touch felt very wrong. In time, Christy developed a severe eating disorder, and she eventually gathered the courage to go to the senior pastor and disclose Mark's behavior toward her. She documented her story and shared it with her pastor in his office, and he read her letter and then asked her to sit down. As she watched, he tore the letter into tiny pieces and informed her that the Bible tells us we must forgive others. And he furthermore declared that she had a sinful heart in being angry toward Mark, and that she needed to confess to God her sin of anger. The pastor prayed with Christy over her sin and admonished her to never repeat the accusations. Shortly after his, Christy's bulimia spun out of control. Sadly, Mark's abuse continued for several more years. Eventually, through the help of a counselor, Christy gained the strength to oppose her church authorities and report Mark to the police. He was eventually convicted of felony sexual abuse for acts he perpetrated on other girls and in the youth group. He was given a 10-year prison sentence. Even after his conviction, Mark's church continued to run a weekly notice in the bulletin publicizing the opportunity to donate toward Pastor Mark's legal defense fund. To this day, this church has never apologized to Christy or her family and still pretends the abuse never happened. While Mark's sexual abuse of Christy was in the least severe category, it didn't involve sexual intercourse or even fondling of the genitals or breasts. It was still extremely damaging, especially in the combination with spiritual abuse. When Christy began getting counseling in junior high, her Christian therapist asked her to draw a self-portrait, a helpful way for counselors to access the impact of abuse on a child's sense of self. To the counter's astonishment, Christy grew a picture of her back. She had such overwhelmed shame she couldn't even draw a picture of her own face. The sexual and spiritual abuse had a powerful synergistic effect. Chrissy's experience illustrates graphic spiritual abuse by two different pastors who should have been her protector. Spiritual abuse is the inappropriate use of spiritual authority. The Bible is a tradition or church authority to force a person to do which is unhealthy. Often it will involve a forceful or a manipulative denial of that person's feelings and convictions. Ultimately, spiritual abuse is based on a denial of one of the most precious pillar doctrines of the Protestant Christianity, namely the priesthood of the believer. This doctrine teaches that while church leaders and spiritual teachers are appropriate and helpful, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, verse 12, every individual believer has the Holy Spirit and has direct access to God, Romans chapter 14, verse 4, verse 5, 1 John chapter 2, verse 27. Thus, every believer. How about I use this? This one. So, wait. No, it's low. Can you hear me now? 1 John chapter 1, verse 2, verse 27. Thus, every believer has a right to discern the will of God through the scriptures and the leading of the Spirit without needing a human priest to intercede to God for him or her. The clearest biblical example of spiritual abusers is seen in the Pharisees, who had on the spiritual manipulation into an art form. They heavily twisted the scriptures to selfishly manipulate others under the guise of spirituality. Matthew chapter 15, verse 1, verse 9. Mark chapter 7, verse 11, verse 13. It is worth noting that the hardest words attributed to Jesus in all the four Gospels are found in Matthew 23, and they are directed at the Pharisees for their spiritual abuse. Jesus exhorted them for using scripture in their own legalistic rules of spirituality to place unbearable Christian spiritual demands on those under their authority, all for their own self-advancement. Matthew chapter 23, verse 1, verse 8. Jesus notes that if the Pharisees had used their spiritual authority properly, they would have demonized their authority, rejected authority titles, and humbly served those under them. Matthew chapter 23, verse 8, verse 12. Jesus places their spiritual abuse in the same category as the most severe physical abuse, for he says, these hypocritical Pharisees are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Matthew chapter 23, verse 31. David Johnson and Jeff Ronner gave 4 lists of a spiritual abusive system. Power posturing. The leaders are preoccupied with their authority and continually remind people of it. This runs contrary to the Bible's teaching that church leaders are not to actively leverage their authority, but are to lead by example, not decree. Luke chapter 22, verse 25, verse 26. 1 chapter Peter, verse 5, verse 3. Performance preoccupied spiritual becomes a matter of eternal performance, not eternal character. Matthew chapter 15, verse 1, verse 12. Unspoken rules. Spiritual abusive churches have unspoken rules such as don't ever disagree with the pastor or you are disloyal and unscriptable. These rules are not discussed openly but are enforced rigidly. The lack of balance. Spirituality. Abusive churches have little or no spiritual balance, and the leaders exhibit either extreme objectively. You must have gratitude degrees to have any spiritual knowledge, or extreme subjectively. The Lord gave me this message, and you must accept it. The Bible is really clear that abuse by religious leaders is extremely destructive. Religious leaders can, in the name of God and Scripture, men apart and destroy others for their own selfish purpose. Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 25, verse 28. Galatians chapter 6, verse 12, verse 13. Spiritual abuse often creates tremendous damage, for it can generate great confusion and perversion regarding the character of God. The people of God and the Word of God, often victims of spiritual abuse, find church attendance, Bible teaching, and even the scriptures themselves to be emotional disturbing because they were the very things employed to manipulate and harm them. The spiritual abuse is also damaging because it programs people to continually distrust their own emotions and convictions and give it to the demands of someone who claims to be more spiritual. Because spiritual abuse leaves no physical marks, it is often minimized by Christians. Some of the most destructive spiritual abuse is that which is subtle and not obvious is hierarchical. Several years ago, my wife, Celestia, had a counseling session with a client named Kathy who potentially demonstrated the destructive power of subtle spiritual abuse. Kathy, who potentially demonstrated the destruction power of subtle abuse. Spiritual abuse. Kathy, dressed, sat on the edge of the sofa. Her beautiful auburn hair and brown eyes were a stark contrast to her stiff demeanor. In her hour-long session, she never relaxed or even leaned back on the sofa. From the outset, she cried and repeatedly apologized for being sad. Kathy didn't know what she was feeling. She had no vocabulary for her sorrow. She had come to see Celesta because of a developing anxiety that was making it difficult for her to leave her own home. Kathy was married to a well-known elder in a large evangelical community church. She homeschooled 4 children, and she had few friends and had no time for personal friendships or for discerningly reading activities. When Cecil asked her about this, she distantly explained that 5 years earlier she had made a $50 purchase without her husband's permission. And when he found out, he became enraged. In front of the children, he lectured her on how God in his love punished the children of Israel when they disobeyed. He declared that he was to love her in the same way. She was to be punished from that point on, and he would no longer give her money for groceries and other household expenses. She would need to babysit to earn that money in her spare hours. That evening, he confiscated her checkbook and credit cards. In the days that followed, he continued to make reference to God-loving punishment and threatened her with even greater punishment if she didn't exhibit total obedience. As Cecilia heard her story and began to describe the true nature of God's love reflected in the way Jesus respectfully and gently responded to Mary Magdalene, and to the other woman. Kathy sobbed uncontrollably, and her heart was resonated with the truth. She was created for that kind of love. She was starving for godly love, having been manipulated and bullied by a self-righteous husband who had twisted the scriptures to humiliate her as an inferior. Kathy left the session in tears, continually apologized for her well-earned sorrow. Sadly, she never came back. It's unlikely that anyone in Kathy's church will ever realize how profoundly and destructively her husband had spiritually abused her. I need to turn the white noise machine. I'm so distracted. Sorry, guys. That book makes me emotional. I've been beaten by my grandmother all my life. I've been beaten severely. Like, I went through a lot. I bled, blood pouring out in my body from being beat to death. I've been pushed down the stairs. I've been through it all. Like, I've been through all the abuse. And I was abused by my own family, that you think you could trust your family, but you can't even trust your family because they're the ones that hurt you the most. They sexual abused me, my two uncles, when I was 7 years old. I never told anybody that, but now I can tell everybody because I'm healed, and even though I'm healed, I still think about the events and it still affects me still. So, but I'm healed and overcame it through Christ. And forgiveness is the key too. Forgive your enemies, forgive them. It doesn't mean you have to talk to them. You just forgive the people that hurt you. But I'm going to take a little break and I'll read later probably.